the man of the hour himself, Glenn Diesen. Glenn Diesen is a Norwegian political scientist. He is professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. Glenn, welcome to the show, man. I followed you for a while. Thank you for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me, though.
Question. Donald Trump said that he was going to end the war in 24 hours. He said he wouldn't even have to be in office yet. In 24 hours, he's going to look Putin and Zelensky in the eye, and both of them apparently were going to fold, and the Ukraine war was going to end. What is he waiting on?
That's a great question because, obviously, he did extend the period. First, they pushed back 100 days, and some saying 6 months. But it is interesting that a meeting or a phone call hasn't even been arranged between him and the Russian president. This seems like a minimum. I'm not sure if this is some power play. So in this negotiation tactics, whoever contacts first is seen to be in the weaker position. I'm not sure if this is the issue, but or maybe it's just feeling out how the negotiations can be approached, because I think in the beginning there was a bit of a swing and a miss. That is the indications coming out of Washington, this idea that Ukraine might be able to join in 20 years or so and join NATO. I think a lot of this was quite absurd, and even his last comments, I think, were demonstrated that he has probably been very misinformed about the war, and this has probably led to a very weak let's call it a weak bargaining position that is taken. So there might be some correction going on. It's a bit early to say, I guess.
But he was always in a weak bargaining. Maybe let me ask it this way. Does the U.S. or Trump, in this case, have leverage that I'm unaware of in regards to Ukraine? He's given all the weapons already. I mean, Joe Biden has already given the weapons. Joe Biden took a maximalist position to all of this. Where else could Trump go in regards to any kind of leverage on Russia?
Well, this is the problem, because whenever he wants to make a great deal, he usually comes in with max pressure, where he threatens to overrun whoever doesn't want to make a deal. So either here's the deal, or we're gonna put a lot of pressure on you. The problem with Russia is, some have suggested, if Russia doesn't meet their demands of Trump, then they would send even more weapons than Biden. But this is a very silly proposition, because if there were weapons, then Biden would have already sent them. I think it's quite obvious that collective NATO has emptied its weapon storages. He also suggested that even though he likes the Russian people, he said he would bring a lot of economic pain. He suggested he can put some pressure to lower oil prices, but it doesn't make any sense why Saudi Arabia would do this, especially at this point in time. And furthermore, it's not that much trade anymore between the Russians and the Americans. And even if he would be able to put more sanctions on the Russians, they would still only push them further towards China and their economic infrastructure, which is what he wants to avoid. So none of this really seems credible. And I just also feel like some of the leverage he thinks he has. I think he thinks Russia is in a much weaker position than it is. He tweeted, or Truth Social, that Russia had lost like 1 million soldiers killed. This is very strange numbers, because you usually with casualty rates you have deaths and injured. With injured, it's usually 2 to 3 or sometimes many more injured. So you would think that the Russians would have casualties about 4 million soldiers. None of this makes any sense. They don't have 4 million soldiers. So all of this is so it seems wild. I never even heard anyone make these claims. Million soldiers dead. I mean, this is crazy. He also suggested that the Ukrainians lose fewer soldiers than the Russians. This also makes no sense whatsoever if you look at where the casualties comes from. So artillery, drones, air power. This is where Russia dominates in all areas, not by a little, by a lot. In artillery, they dominate somewhere between 7 and 10 times more artillery, and and this is the main king of the battlefield. And yet Russia lost more than Ukraine. It doesn't really make sense. I think a lot of these narratives have been spun in the media for one purpose, and this is to to create consent among the population to keep the war going, to suggest we can win. So as long as we go for a long war. So I think he maybe bought into some of these narratives, which are at this point deviated so far away from reality. So anyways, my point is simply this: if he thinks that he's in a strong position, that he has many tools he can use against Russia, and the Russians are in a very weak position, then he can come out with guns blazing and put mass pressure on Russia. But this is false. He doesn't have anything else to do to threaten with, and Russia's not in a weak position at all.
Yeah,
So
I agree with you. Yeah, and I think he may be coming to that conclusion. You know, it's one thing to talk about it outside of the office. It's another thing to get into the office and they say, okay, what are your options? And it's like,
yeah,
you know, there's nothing there, right? It's like you've already sent the weapons, you've already passed the sanctions, you've taken a maximalist approach already. So it's like, okay, where do you go beyond this maximalist approach? Assume for the moment that Trump does want a deal. Let's say he does want a deal. Is there a deal to be had? And, you know, I've asked this from the very beginning. How do you end this war? Because what Russia is not going to allow is a situation like in Syria, where you have this kind of frozen conflict that can spring up on a whim. The moment that one side is not necessarily at the most, let's say, at best, to kind of push back the assault. I don't get the sense that Russia wants this kind of frozen conflict. I get the sense that they want to resolve it once and for all, and not just resolve it for Ukraine, but to come up with a new security architecture of Europe. I guess the first question is that deal even available? Is it even possible to get a new security architecture of Europe using Ukraine as kind of a gateway to do that?
Well, I think that's the right question. This is what should be asked to Trump, because ever since 2014, if you read through the think tanks like Rand, who's very much linked up with the American intelligence community, it was writing papers since 2014 how the Ukraine war could be used to destabilize Russia's borders. If you send in some more weapons, threaten NATO expansion, then Russia would have to get more involved. You can bleed them a bit. So this was the ideal utility of using Ukraine, which would be to gradually bleed the Russians over time. This is why they've always gone for a long war. This is why they sabotaged peace negotiations in early 2022. And this is what the Russians also don't want. They don't want a long war. They want and that a ceasefire simply would allow NATO to rearm Ukraine and fight later. So they don't want this. Why would they want a ceasefire now that they're winning quite obviously, and they're winning faster by the day? So it doesn't make any sense. And again, this is hardly a conspiracy theory. If you listen to the European leaders, what are they saying? Well, let's have a ceasefire. Ukraine has time to recover. We can get up our industrial production. We can rearm Ukraine. And let's not cede any territory. We can address that a different day. I mean, this is not going to work. This is again a continuation of a long war, and the Russians will not have it anymore. So I guess what the Russians demand is what they got in Istanbul, which was Ukraine was supposed to restore its neutrality, but of course in that deal the Russians would withdraw from Ukrainian territory. But after 3 years of war, that's not going to happen. And Russia already annexed 4 of the oblasts in Ukraine. So they want Istanbul Plus, which is neutrality for Ukraine and accept that the territory has shifted hands. Now, I make the point often that I think the Russians might have more flexibility in terms of the territorial question. They will not cede territory they're holding now, but the territory they annexed, a large part of the territory is not under their control yet, especially on the western side of the Dnieper River, that is part of the Kherson and Zaporozhye territory. So they might be able to do some territory swap, do some compromise, but as long as they get neutrality for Ukraine and no more, and nothing that can look like a long war. So when Zelensky talks about 200,000 Western, including American and European peacekeepers along the borders, this is what Russia invaded to prevent. And this is somehow the solution when Russia is winning. I mean, none of this makes any sense at all. It's considered to be immoral to say, now we take a hard line against Russia, but all it means is we're rejecting any form of the diplomacy and any possible solution. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are being decimated battlefield and losing important cities every day. So it's a highly immoral thing to do, to put these ridiculous demands for negotiation, that Russia should pull out completely and 200,000 troops should enter. I mean, it's absurd.
Yeah. What do you make of Budanov's comment recently? I mean, they're trying to walk it back now, but Budanov apparently in a meeting, he was asked, hey, well, what do you think about the situation on the battlefield? And he pointed out that Ukraine could cease to exist if they don't have actual peace negotiations. Now, this is fascinating, coming from spy chief, the man who likes the darkness, as I believe it was Time magazine pointed out. He's like, he likes the darkness. He's like Batman.
Yeah.
What do you make of that comment? I mean, is this an awareness? Is this kind of internal, honest assessment? Is this coming to Jesus? Or what? Well, for one, do you think he said it? There's that, because now they're trying to walk back the story. But two, what do you make of the story? Do you think it's legit? Do you think that, let's say, like Lithuania, Poland, if they had the opportunity, would try to take parts of Ukraine? How do you view this?
Well, I think where it comes from is very reasonable, because again, this has been a war of attrition. I think people focus too much on whether or not the front lines were moving a lot, but in a war of attrition, the first objective is to exhaust the adversary, and you don't go for territory if it's going to cost you a lot of manpower and equipment. So this is why, if you look at the manpower, and we don't lie about the numbers like we often do in the media, then you would see that the Russians have been winning this war for a very long time, and the Ukrainians are weakened extremely. And this is why they opened a new front in Kharkov. Just as Ukraine was weakened, they wanted to extend their forces further. And in summer, something really broke with Avdiivka falling, and suddenly now you see that now that the Ukrainian army has been slowly unraveling since the summer, they can't hold on proper to the cities anymore. They're losing more and more men because they're not well trained. You have huge people deserting. You have more people surrendering. So they're not able to hold on to the cities anymore. And you see the Russians now being able to take a lot of cities without that much damage to the cities and the villages. So it's if the cities are obviously falling much faster by the day. And so I agree very much. I don't think Ukraine can't stand on its feet for the rest of this year. I think by summertime, you might have a massive collapse. And if this happens, then there's no negotiations. Then Russia will do exactly what it wants. So I think it's real. But of course, the reason it has to be walked back, it goes against NATO's narrative for a long war. NATO keeps saying if Ukraine stops fighting, there will be no Ukraine. Well, now Budanov is saying, well, if Ukraine continues to fight, there will be no Ukraine. So this is the opposite. And so it's not, there's a tendency among NATO to stay very loyal to the narrative, irrespective of what's happening on the ground. And I think this is why Budanov said what was real, but he also had to walk it back, because this doesn't fit with the long war narrative.
You make a super interesting point that if they keep fighting, the Ukrainian military could collapse on the battlefield. Now, the Washington Post had an article, I think this was maybe a week ago, effectively saying that it would be better for Ukraine to effectively get beaten on the battlefield as opposed to Donald Trump coming up with a deal. And it's like, okay, this is outrageous. I mean, this is still to the last dead Ukrainian thing. But as you pointed out, if they collapse on the battlefield, then what? Like, what does that look like if the Ukrainian military collapses on the battlefield?
Well, then Russia can take what it wants, but there won't be any political settlement between the West and Russia. And this will make sure that a new Cold War will effectively continue. And because this war happened for one reason, and this is that the European security architecture effectively broke down, because the whole European security architecture was premised on the idea that as long as NATO continuously expand and go closer and closer to the Russian borders, this would be the recipe for stability and peace. It was always nonsense. It was always going to lead to war. And so I can see why a settlement now would undermine the credibility of NATO. And if there's no peace negotiations, then they can always do some guerrilla warfare or try to make a new Afghanistan out of Ukraine. So there's many reasons behind this, but I think it's I disagree with that assessment, even if it would be cynical and just want to use the Ukrainians for fighting, because I think that the Russians would be willing not to take so much territory if they knew that the territory that remains belongs to Ukraine and is neutral. And I'm often made this point: if, for example, Odessa, it can either be part of NATO or Russia, then Russia will definitely annex it. They can't accept what was historically a Russian city to fall into the hands of NATO. However, if NATO can accept Ukraine's neutrality, then Odessa could remain in Ukraine. So this is why I think it's very damaging and cynical to just allow Ukraine to collapse completely, because the country would become landlocked. Their economy would never be able to recover. They would have a demographic crisis. I mean, this is just human decency. We should try to save what we can of Ukraine. And this idea that we've been helping them by rejecting all negotiations, diplomacy, and pumping weapons in, I think this is nonsense. It's quite a mountain of evidence already showing that the objective was to bleed Russia, it was not to help Ukraine. Even Zelensky recognized this almost 3 years ago.
What do you make of Europe in all of this? I have to be honest, I've been shocked at the degree to which Europe has been willing to, let's say, accept its vassal status with the US. And what I mean by that is, the US would say, we need you to get rid of oil, or we need you to put sanctions on energy. We need you to, it's been a maximalist approach all the way through. And if you think about it, the money that Europe is sending, the 200 billion or whatever that number is, most of that money has come to the US in order to buy weapons. If you think of the increase in oil costs, most of the money has been coming to the US. Yes, they've been paying Russia, or let's say Saudi Arabia or India or one of these other countries where they're getting Russian oil from a third party. But they've also been buying oil from the US, LNG from the US at like 5 times a markup. Meaning it seems like a cash infusion going from Europe into America, with Ukraine being the reason or the rationale for it. Even the destruction of Nord Stream, again, that's directly against energy's security interests. And yet Europe continues to go along with it. And to boot, wouldn't even put the blame on the US, despite the fact that Joe Biden had pointed out, if Russia goes in, we're going to end the pipeline. How do you place Europe into all of this? They seem to be, let's say, receding in regards to any kind of political clout in world affairs. And they seem to be kind of taking the secondary status with the US. Do you see that changing anytime soon, considering the negative consequences the war has had on Europe?
Well, I think this is one of the things the Europeans don't understand, that for many centuries now, they're used to being the center of power, at least up until World War II. And so they've always been the object of security, the ones who make the decisions, the one who have a seat at the table, moving the pieces around. But Europeans have now been demoted from the subject to the object. Now, while the subject's the one moving the pieces, the object is what's being moved around. Yeah. And I don't think the Europeans appreciate this. They even keep referring to that they're equal partners with the United States. I don't think they understand. No, of course they're not. This is it's ludicrous. It's not a serious proposition, but you see, but this is the purpose. This is other side of the coin with the military alliances. You use an alliance system for 2 reasons. You can weaken your adversary, be it you can use the Europeans to weaken Russia. You can use the Taiwanese, the Japanese, Filipinos to weaken the Chinese. You can use the Arabs to weaken Iran. But at the other side of that coin, it's not just weakening your adversary, it's also creating security dependence on your allies. And so this is why there's always an interest in an alliance system to perpetuate conflicts, because this also ensures the continued obedience by your allies. And this is again, it's not hardly a new theory, but if this is why you saw in the 1990s, when there was no more Soviet threat, the Europeans, the Americans couldn't convert the security dependence into political and economic loyalties. So the EU began to aspire for what they called, European sovereignty, more independence from the US. They were going to strategic autonomy, all these, all synonyms for having more independence. Well, as soon as this war kicked in, the Europeans saw themselves as very vulnerable again, and the Americans were able to convert all security dependence into political obedience. And this is what you saw. And you're very correct. Nord Stream, again, the United States attacked the main infrastructure, energy infrastructure in Europe. Through the Inflation Reduction Act, they cannibalized a lot of the German industries. And the German president of Germany, gave Biden a medal, for Christ's sake. This is how they respond to it. I mean, it's absurd. And now, 2 days or I'm not sure when it was, but after Trump said he would take Greenland, and Denmark's prime minister is shocked that actually he means it. He wants to seize their territory. The EU foreign policy chief, Callas, she was asked, well, what do you think about this? And maybe we shouldn't take it too literally, making excuses. It's
serious. I'm telling you, serious. I live here.
Stockholm syndrome here, big time. This is very, very problematic. But this is what happens in security alliances. And this is not just Europe. Trump just made a speech that they should put tariffs on Taiwan so they can get the semiconductor industry over to the United States. In a situation where we're now, where the United States can't really compete that well with China, the US will become more heavy-handed with its allies, that is, their vassals, and they will begin to cannibalize their industry, and they will demand greater political and economic loyalty. So the Europeans, not only do they have to cut themselves off from Russia, China, and any other rival center of power, but they also have to sacrifice themselves now, and it's absurd. I don't think it can go on forever. I think the political class in Europe are very much very obedient. But if a country can't preserve or defend its national interest, what's going to happen? Well, it's very predictable. The country will do very poorly, and in that vacuum, new political forces emerge. And this is why we're having political legitimacy crisis across Europe, from Britain, France, Germany. It's trying to be held back, but at some point it will break. This is not going to last. You can't have a whole continent ignoring its own basic interests. Mm-hmm. So,
and like I said, I've been shocked by it. And just to show the clip that you were referring to with Trump in China and Taiwan, because this is pretty astonishing. Like, it's one thing.
Placing tariffs on farm.
Oh yeah, that's my tweet.
It's one thing for let me play the clip first, and I want to get your take on it, because I want to go to Greenland for a bit. And what does this kind of push against either Taiwan or Greenland? It seems Trump has come to this conclusion that, why do I need to have a pretense? These countries are my vassals. I can just tell them what to do and they do it, and I can use sanction pressure as a way of forcing their obedience. It's pretty wild. This is Trump going after Taiwan.
Placing tariffs on foreign production of computer chips, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals to return production of these essential goods to the United States of America. They left us and they went to Taiwan, which is about 98% of the chip business, by the way. And we want them to come back, and we don't want to give them billions of dollars like this ridiculous program that Biden has. Give everybody billions of dollars. They already have billions of dollars. They've got nothing but money, Joe. They didn't need money. They needed an incentive, and the incentive is going to be they're not going to want to pay a 25, 50, or even 100% tax. They're going to build their factory with their own money. We don't have to give them money. They're going to come in because it's good for them to come in. They're giving them money. They don't even know what they're going to do with it. I had people tell me, we have no idea. We didn't need money. They don't know if they're probably going to use the money to build in other places, other countries. It's a ridiculous plan, very expensive and ridiculous.
I have to be honest, I am fascinated by this. I am deeply fascinated by this. In one sense, Trump is freezing federal expenditures going out to other countries. So let's say like USAID, I would imagine National Endowment for Democracy, all of these NGOs for the most part. There's a spending freeze on all of them. And this includes Ukraine, in which case it's kind of biting into Ukraine's, military aspirations or their planning and everything else. But while he is simultaneously putting a freeze on the money that's going out to other countries, he is also turning around and saying, not only am I not going to give you any money, I am also now going to threaten you with sanctions if you don't do what I tell you to do. So I don't need to give you an inducement for you to bring your stuff here. I can just threaten you to do it. And by the way, he's doing the same thing with Greenland. He's doing the same thing with Canada. He's talking about doing something similar with the Panama Canal. What does this mean that he's willing to go this route? Like, what does it mean that America has now effectively said, you know what, this ally stuff, it's not in our interest. We need to create this kind of juggernaut of a country by subsuming Canada, Panama, Greenland, etc. Are we in a new world in the way that this is functioning?
Yeah, definitely. And again, I've been writing about this for the past decade, that this was going to happen, and for a good reason. Because when you, there's some conditions when you can have a very liberal economic international system, that is. When there's a lot of power concentrated in a hegemon, be it Britain in the 19th century or the US in the 20th, then that hegemon has an interest in creating trust in a very liberal economic system. That is, if free trade is good, if you have the best technologies, because then your high quality, low cost production can saturate the market. It's in your interest of free trade if you're controlling the main maritime transportation corridors. It's in your interest to have free trade if you control the main international banks, the payment systems, the currency being used for both reserve and for trade. So, but what happens when that hegemony is in decline? Well, we've seen this before. This is when the hegemon begins to use this administrative power over the international economy to strengthen its own position. And this is why they're stealing the sovereign funds of the Russian central bank. They're not even pretending that this economic coercion against China is about human rights anymore. They very much said we can't compete in terms of tech. We just have to see if we can sabotage something. And then, of course, they also have to purge their allies or cannibalize them, because this is what the hegemon does in decline, and it is a declining hegemon. And this is why it was very, very predictable that this was going to happen. And sensible countries, when you see a declining hegemon, what you do is you diversify your economic connectivity. You make yourself less exposed. The Europeans, however, they can't imagine really a world which is not organized around the collective hegemony of the West or the hegemony of the United States. So in this country, for example, they're just doubling down. They say, oh, let's just open American bases across the country. We will increase our own stock value for the Americans, and they won't leave us. And they will continue to... But this is not going to happen. The main thing is America will demand more and more from its partners, and it will be able to give less and less. This is the shift from unipolarity to multipolarity. Countries who can't adjust, they're going to have a very, very difficult time. And this is why you're seeing the Europeans go through a very, very difficult time now. And it's only going to get worse.
But their economic output is clearly going down. I mean, Ursula von der Leyen, in one of the economic plans, apparently she's planning on cutting a huge amount of red tape around environmental or climate action, with the idea of trying to make Europe a better haven or more of a home for business, hoping to spur business development, considering that business development is lagging. But they don't seem to quite get, though, that part of that is energy. Like, if you're paying 5 times more for energy, or you're paying a huge amount for energy, then those companies are less incentivized to open up businesses in Europe as opposed to somewhere like America or somewhere else. I guess I don't get how Europe is so blind to this, even though it seems to be apparent from outside of Europe.
Well, even in Germany, they're beginning to ask questions. So, for example, why are we buying Russian gas from India? If they could buy it directly from Russia, and it would be cheaper, and Russia still gets paid, so it doesn't matter. So none of this makes sense anymore. But it's just that they're so committed to the narrative that reality is effectively demoted. But what you're referring to was an old experience. This was in the early 19th century during the Industrial Revolution. The countries realized, first Alexander Hamilton, then it was learned by the French, the Germans, the Japanese, that you needed industrialization. It was intrinsically linked to nation building, to political
Right.
sovereignty. This is why the Americans had the American system. If you don't have some technological sovereignty, then you don't have political independence. And we're going through an industrial revolution now. Everything's becoming digitalized, not just communication, but even the physical world is beginning to be dominated by tech giants. And Europe doesn't have any. All the big tech companies in Europe are American, and unlike
Ooh.
the Chinese and the Russians, who knew that the Americans were not their friend, they build up their own the assumption was that we are friends. This is how our politicians think. It's not that this is an alliance where the U.S. takes what it wants. It's a friend, so we can always trust the Americans will look after us. I mean, it's a very weird way of we're looking at international politics. But now they find themselves in a position where the use of currencies, payments, technologies, everything is in the hands of the United States. And when the US put the screws on, there's very little the Europeans can do. So my point is, there's no they didn't digitalize in Europe. And second, as you pointed out, the industries, the more traditional industries they had, and the real industrial center of Europe was Germany. They have a very energy-intensive industries, and they need cheap and reliable energy. Luckily, we had the biggest energy provider in the world right next door, which is Russia. But under this effort of creating a Europe where Russia's not part of it, we unavoidably ended up in a conflict with the Russians, cut ourselves off completely, and now the industry is deindustrializing, and our relevance is declining very, very quickly.
Two more questions. One on BRICS. How does BRICS fit into this new world order that seems to be evolving, this kind of multipolar world?
Well, I actually often compare it to, again, on the topic of the American system. If you remember back in those days, 200 years ago, the main objective of the United States was it couldn't be too dependent on the British. So they had these three pillars. They wanted, they need a manufacturing base, so the technologies, ports, roads, so the physical connectivity, and a national bank. What the Chinese, Russians, and others have done, which is being organized around BRICS, is effectively the same. They're developing their own tech centers, which are cooperating with each other to be able to replace the U.S. from their supply chains, as the U.S. is no longer seen as being reliable. They're pushing this Belt and Road Initiative, having physical connectivity between all these countries. And of course, the last is the financial pillar, which is develop their own development banks, their own payment systems, use their own currencies. It can be crypto, effectively decoupling a bit from the United States, not in a bloc politics, but reducing this excessive dependence, which is behind, which enables the U.S. hegemony. So there's a huge demand for it, because, as I mentioned before, when hegemony is in decline, it will no longer, uphold a liberal international economic system. It will abuse its position to prevent the rise of rivals. It would abuse allies in order to strengthen its own position, and this is what we've seen. And this is why there's a huge demand for BRICS now. Even friends of America, when you use those words, like India, they don't want to be dependent on America to have to listen to get Washington's approval if they want to trade with India or buy energy from the Russians. Of course not. So they all want to diversify, so the Americans can't shut off their access to insurance, their transportation corridors, their banks, the availability of currencies, technology they depend on. So this is the reason why everyone's flooding to BRICS is they're offering cheaper, more reliable access to the international economy. And this is what the world needs when you have a declining hegemon.
Well, I get the sense, though, that what Trump is doing is somewhat short-sighted. That the same reason that BRICS, or the very reason that BRICS exists, is because of this kind of big footing that the U.S. has been doing, either with sanctions, either using the dollar as a weapon, etc. I mean, how do you view that? I mean, what Trump is trying to do, either with Greenland, what Donald Trump is trying to do, either with Taiwan, or with Europe as a whole, do you think this is going to backfire in regards to BRICS either growing? I mean, right now they've already added Indonesia. They have the UAE, Saudi Arabia. I believe Saudi Arabia is a partner, if it's not necessarily already part of BRICS. They have Iran. Basically, they're expanding their reach with more and more countries that seem to be interested in getting involved in the BRICS organization. it seems that this is counterproductive. What the U.S. is doing under Trump right now, I feel like this is going to backfire.
It is going to backfire in a big way, because if it was two poles of power, like an American-led bloc and a BRICS-led bloc, then of course you can try to push countries into your side of the ledger. But the whole point of BRICS is it's not supposed to be anti-American. They're not trying to force country not to only trade with China and not with America. It's supposed to be anti-hegemonic. That is, this is why countries like India is part of it. They don't want to be part of an anti-American club. They just don't want to live under American dominance. So this is very different story. So I think this is why you will see there's such a huge demand for BRICS, and of course it can backfire when Trump, for example, asks or tries to put pressure on Saudi Arabia to reduce the price of oil, which it needs to in order to bring down the prices to put pressure on Russia. This is absurd. The Saudis are going through a modernization program. They can't afford to do this. Also, why would they turn on their friends? Russia and China are important nodes of power. They don't want to join the Chinese or Russian alliance, but they want to diversify their economic partnerships. As long as you have many partners, you avoid excessive dependence on one center of power, and then that one center of power can't use you as a vassal. So they don't want to do this. And the more pressure the United States puts on them, the more obvious it's going to be that they really need to reduce their dependence. Now, Greenland is interesting because I think I think everyone can see now that there will be a competition for the Arctic. The United States is militarizing Scandinavia very heavily, not just bringing Finland and Sweden into NATO, but also scattering military bases across Norway. And they have very clear objectives in the Arctic. So, of course, seizing Greenland would make the United States a massive Arctic power, given that they have Alaska is the only footprint the United States have up there. But can it backfire? Definitely. I think Macron in France even suggested that the French might send their troops up to Greenland, but this is nonsense. Trump can ask him to go back home, and they will obey probably. So I think they're just posturing. I think if the United States really want to take Greenland, I think the Europeans would actually start to make excuses for the Americans. So this. This is but of course it could backfire.
Well, what's wild about it, some of the reporting that's been coming out is saying that the Danish prime minister is effectively telling the European Union to not bring it up. It's like, just be quiet about it. Let's just have this kind of whisper campaign, because they're concerned that if they're loud about it, that Donald Trump will become that much more adamant. That the plan is to just be quiet. If you're just quiet about it, maybe it'll just blow over. Maybe it'll just go away. That is pretty astonishing. That's their plan. If we don't talk about it, it's almost like the kid who's being abused, and it's like, well, if we don't talk about it, it's not going to be as bad. But if you say something about it, it's going to get worse. That is the assessment they've effectively come to. Do you think that's right?
Well, there might be something to that. I think if you put Trump on the spot and try to embarrass him, saying, "Oh, we will stand up for it, there's nothing you can do," he might see that as a challenge because he's the alpha dog, But I would say, but that being said, there is something remarkably, subordinated around this whole thing.
Passive, humiliating. Like there's so many words for that. Like it's a sovereignty issue.
But this was the same with Nord Stream. Again, the United States attacked the main energy infrastructure of Europe, again under Biden, and all the media, all the politicians thought it would make sense to say, "Oh, this is the Russian playbook." Yes, because Russia blows up billions of dollars of its own infrastructure instead of turning off the tap, because this is what Russia do to send a message. I mean, it's so, because Russia rather use LNG. I mean, none of this ever makes any sense. But again, the bloc discipline has been brought up to 100 now, and there is full discipline. They're doing what America wants them to do, and it in the hope that there's even this hope that if Europe just supports America enough, they can restore their hegemonic position, and we can go back to the way it was in the 90s. Because the dream of the EU was to have collective hegemony in the world of the West consisting of two pillars, the US and the EU. And as I began in this talk, my point is the Europeans don't realize they don't have a seat next at the table with America. They're not the subject here. They're the object, and they don't understand that just like we moved our pieces around our colonies in the past, so are we being moved around. We still think that it's America and Europe shoulder by shoulder, that we're some kind of in the same democratic club, and we're all into values, and it's absurd. It's how you frame. This is political propaganda. You frame power politics in the language of values, but this is not what drives the great powers. But it's very unsettling to see this kind of obedience.
It's rather astonishing. I live here. I can that is not the way America thinks. Like that is we do not look at the world as being equals. We look at it enemy or vassal. That's kind of the way it functions. And you may get, let's say, like a Joe Biden, who may use the language of friends and buddies and everything else, but it's still effectively the same, very similar. Two last questions before I let you go. Would Ukraine be part of the European Union?
It would be
We're talking about expediting membership.
Well, I know this could be a part of Trump's suggestion that they can't join NATO because, again, this is a declaration of war against Russia, and also that would. Right. Then Ukraine would have every incentive in the world to simply go back to war with Russia, because then NATO would be on its side to retake any territories and, well, destroy Russia if it wants. So this is not going to happen. And I think Trump realizes this, but the consolidation price appears to be, you can join the EU instead because, well, it doesn't matter to Trump. But I think there's more opposition within that in Europe. Even if you look at the military side, for example, wanting to Ukraine join NATO, Poland is number one. They want Ukraine to join NATO. They're one of the more militaristic countries. They're sending, mercenaries or soldiers under the Ukrainian flag to fight there. But when it comes to the EU, they're not so happy anymore because the way the EU is set up, a lot of the subsidies from the EU would not go to Poland. It would go to Ukraine because it's much less developed. Not only this, but the agricultural industry in Poland is important, but they can't compete against Ukraine and even at the EU level because in the Ukraine they have the black soil. It's just they have a much cheaper, more productive agriculture industry. They would knock out the Poles there fast. So the Polish, while they're in military sense very supportive of Ukraine, I'm not sure they would want them into the EU. So no. I don't think any countries really want Ukraine into the EU. And this has been the problem all along. I don't think anyone really saw them in having Ukraine in NATO was a good idea either. This was never about any love for Ukraine. It's about hatred of Russia. And that's why they want Ukraine into the Western orbit, is to prevent it from being aligned with Russia. Again, this is my main point. When you're willing to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, it's not love for Ukrainians, it's hatred of Russia, which is motivating you.
No, that's a really good point. Because I kept saying the same thing. It's like, how do they think that losing 25% of territory and 500,000 people is somehow to the betterment of Ukraine? It's not. Last question. Serbia, Georgia, Romania, Slovakia. So Georgia, there was this Maidan 2.0 push that they were trying to effectively overthrow the Georgian government. The French-born, I'll call her a spook because I think she was working a stalking horse for the European Union, but she gets evicted. All right, so the Maidan 2.0 innocence of Georgia gets crushed. Serbian prime minister, correct me if I'm wrong, just resigned. The Georgia election, I'm sorry, not the Georgia election, the Romanian election was canceled by the court because of TikTok videos that eventually ended up being associated with one of the liberal parties in Romania. And in Slovakia, Fico is talking about a color revolution taking place. What is going on with all of this? Are all of these things coming from the same source?
Well, what is interesting, which has happened just now, is that Trump he just canceled foreign aid for 90 days, suspended it, and only today I've seen complaints coming in from what they call themselves independent media in both Hungary and in in Ukraine, which now say, "Oh, we lost the vast majority of our funding from U.S. aid." So this is the idea that the foreign government aligned with government geopolitical interests are financing NGOs and media, and somehow this is independent. No, it's a way of capturing the civil society of other countries. And this has always been, how much evidence has been behind this? At least in the early 2000s, there's a lot of honesty when the Americans used NGOs to topple the government in Georgia in 2003 and Ukraine 2004. A lot of newspapers across the West wrote that this was obviously American staged coup, that this was using NGOs to, win other people's elections. There's a lot of criticism. Now it's kind of disappeared with our new obedience. But no, I think it's obvious what's happening in Romania. In the presidential election, he won the election, but he was a populist. He came a bit out of nowhere, and of course, he was for ending the war in Ukraine. He's critical of the role NATO's played in this war. So there was no time to stop the election, so they just annulled the results, and they say, "Oh well, it's probably Russian interference." Has been not a shred of evidence that there's been. But of course, if you criticize it, then you might be speaking on behalf of Putin. So it's you can't win with these people. All you have to say is Russian disinformation or interference. There has to be no evidence at all. So again, it was a bit of a Russia gate for the Romanians. So their democracy, their election was taken away from them. In Hungary, it's the same. They activated the NGOs. They're taking to streets to go against Orban because he's been critical of the Ukraine war. And Slovakia, the streets are also filled. Again, NGOs, finance NGOs are taking the lead in terms of organizing revolts. And the same applied in Georgia. It was said, the Georgian dream that they're all Putinists is nonsense. They all want to join the EU. They're very critical of Russia. They merely recognized, we live on Russia's border. If we're going to start to accommodate foreign troops here or get involved in Ukraine, we're going to get hammered. And even the prime minister, they're warned, they're going to use us to open a second front against Russia. Now you have a president who had to step down after the loss, and you're correct. She's born in France, and after she lost the election, she joined an NGO, the John McCain Institute, in America. So she, they have no shame really. Now my point is, all of these NGOs, it's very open what's happened. It's not like it's a conspiracy theory. In 1983, with National Endowment for Democracy, Ronald Reagan, he gave even the inauguration speech. They set it up deliberately so that they wouldn't have to use covert intelligence agencies. They could just finance NGOs, which are financed by the U.S. government, staffed by people aligned with the U.S. government, and this is how you go forth. Just start to go on. But in 2004, during the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the head of Freedom House there was the former CIA director, Woosley. I mean, you can't make this up. Even Nuland, who was having such a central role in the coup in Ukraine and such a top role in the U.S. government, now she's on the board of National Endowment for Democracy, which are financing all these NGOs.
Amazing.
One of the NGOs they're financing actually is in this country, and they keep calling the university and sending letters trying to have me fired from the university because I've been very critical of NATO's role in the war. So this is what NGOs are. They're not independent. They're not caring. They don't care that much about human rights. And all of the document is already there since the late 80s, early 90s. You have so many books which have been written by former CIA whistleblowers. You have documents showing the cooperation between the CIA and these NGOs. It shouldn't even be a disguise. This should be established as a fact, but no one wants to bring it up because then they come for you as well. So
Wow.
it's So no. If you understand all of these uprisings, the NGOs have a very important role in it.
Glenn Diesen. Glenn Diesen is a Norwegian political scientist. He is professor at the University of Southeastern Norway.
Yeah.
Glenn, thank you for this, man. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you.
Me too. Thanks. It's good to see you.